We'll be in Mark chapter 15 this morning, if you want to open up there. But we'll also be in both of the other gospel accounts that record this same event. So we'll be in Luke chapter 23 a little bit and Matthew chapter 27. So that'll be confusing enough for us. But what we're talking about this morning is another in the series that we've been going through of individuals that show great faith in spite of not being Christians in the New Testament or not being Jews in the Old Testament, but those who are outside of, those who are unbelievers, but show great faith. And this morning we're taking a look at a centurion. Now, if you'll recall, it was just a couple months ago that we looked at a centurion who encountered Jesus, who displayed great faith in asking him to heal his servant. This is a different one. This is the one that we're familiar with because he was there at the cross. And so one of the questions that we'll ask a couple of times today is this: if you had been there, what would you have said? If you were there as an eyewitness to the events of the cross, what would you have said? And we'll get to see the words of this individual. We'll get to ask what those words mean and see what we can learn from them. For the context of the story that we're telling this morning, the context is the story. The only story in history that really matters. It is the story that's the center of the Bible. It's the story of Christ. It's this story. The story that has the Son of God come to this earth to die for our sins. And near the end of his life, that he would be betrayed by one of his best friends. That he would be taken and had a trial that was as fake as it could be delivered over into the hands of Roman soldiers who would beat him, who would humiliate him, who would mock him, and then to be hanged on the cross for 3 hours of total misery, and then to die. And right in the middle of that, there's one man who sees all that happened. There are a lot of people that saw it happen, but this man sees it, and for whatever reason, the gospel writers and the Holy Spirit found it important enough to say exactly what this man said. So that's the words that we're going to take a look at. A little bit more context, we have some of the words that Jesus himself says as he is dying. There are a couple of different phrases that he uses. From Mark 15, in verse 34, he says famously, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Quoting from the 22nd Psalm. But if you go farther into the story, Luke alone records in Luke 23 and verse 46, it says, "And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last." These are the last words of Jesus. Some of the other things he says on the cross obviously are close to the last words, but here are the last things that he would say. And then you have his death, but not just his death, but the events that surround his death. What was happening as Jesus died? A couple of texts we can look at. These come from Matthew 27. In verse 45 it says, "Now from the 6th hour until the 9th hour there was darkness over all the land." And then from verse 51 and on, it says, "Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many of the bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many." Any one of these events that took place should have been enough to convince someone standing there of what the truth of this situation was. And so what we get to see is this one person who responds to this. So we'll stick with Matthew for just a second. Matthew 27, verse 54. This is one of the recordings of what is said. Matthew 27, verse 54, it says, "So when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, they feared greatly, saying, Truly, this was the Son of God." A couple of things to know about what Matthew says. One, he says that the response that's made, that this is the Son of God, that this happened after the earthquake and the other events that took place. So at least part of the reason that this statement gets said, that he was the Son of God, is not just about Christ himself, but because they saw miraculous events taking place around his death. And there were plenty to look at. They maybe heard of what had happened in the temple, but they saw that the sun went away for a time. They felt the earth shake. And so they're aware of these things going on, and that doesn't happen when you normally crucify someone, and yet strange things are going on, and it's abnormal compared to what they're used to. But the other thing that Matthew records, and he's the only one that mentions this, is that it's not actually the centurion alone, but it says when the centurion and those with him. And so while we always attribute this phrase to an individual, and he is the one that probably said it, there was a crowd with him, probably of other Roman soldiers and maybe other Jews standing by, and that group observed what had happened, and they agreed with the centurion here in saying, this man was the Son of God. So it's not just the faith of an individual necessarily, but several people that come together. Turn over to Mark's account, back in Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15, this will be verse 39, where we see this same statement being recorded. But as always, the Gospels record things just differently enough that we get a couple of different perspectives. Mark 15, verse 39. So when the centurion who stood opposite him, that is, stood facing him, right next to him, when the centurion who stood opposite him saw that he cried out like this and breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. So Mark says that this happened in a special way, in a different way, in a way that impressed the centurion. The question when it comes to a centurion is, what is their background that would make this statement, what would give this statement more meaning, more weight? And if you think about a centurion, they worked their way up through the ranks of being a Roman soldier, which in all likelihood means that they saw actual combat. In all likelihood, they faced life and death situations, in which case they handed out death as the result. This centurion has been put in charge of a select group of Roman soldiers that would be part of the guard or the garrison of Jerusalem. And so he is somewhat high-ranking even, and he's in charge of this execution. You think this is the first execution that he's ever been a part of? The question is, what I'm trying to get at is this: how many people do you think this centurion had watched die? And yet when he saw the way that Christ died, something was different. No matter how many other people he had watched personally die, this one, there was something special about what was going on. And so what was it that was different? Was it the forgiveness that he showed to those who had put him in that place? Was it the grace and the poise that he showed throughout the whole process? Was it his willingness to lay down his life that was so different? What was it that made it special? There's something. Something was different about the way in which Christ died that impressed the centurion more than anyone else that he had seen. In Luke chapter 23, this is the one other place that we'll see this. Luke chapter 23, this is verse 47. Luke 23 and verse 47. It says, so when the centurion saw what had happened, very similar to before, he glorified God, saying, certainly this was a righteous man. A couple of things we might want to look at. One, where he says that this was a righteous man. Certainly that's true, but to me it almost sounds like a lesser statement of faith. The other two have him saying this is the Son of God. This is just saying, well, he's kind of a good guy. We would want to point out with that, though, just because Luke records him as saying this statement, that does not exclude him saying the other statement. In fact, he probably said both of these things and more. And not only him, but the group that was with him. So don't get too narrowly focused on what one phrase is used in one place versus another. The other thing that we want to point out here, and this kind of ties Mark and Luke's account together. What it said in Mark was, when he saw the way that he cried out like this and breathed his last, okay? That was what convinced him. Well, when you read in Luke, it gives a little bit more detail as to the way in which Christ cried out, because it's the one that tells us from verse 46 exactly what was said. Mark just says that he did cry out, but Luke says in Luke 23:46, and when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. What's important about putting Mark and Luke together there? I think, if I'm not wrong, that there's a phrase in Luke's account that may make this miraculous, may make this more obvious as to what the centurion saw and heard in the last words of Christ that were so special. Not that the other events didn't also lead to him showing this display of faith. Certainly it was the miracle, certainly it was the whole process of the crucifixion. But in this last moment, what was said that was different? What was done that was different? What it says is, and when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice. Consider for just a minute the position that Christ is in when it describes him this way. He has been awake for the last 36 hours or so. He has been beaten within an inch of his life intentionally. He has been humiliated. He's been spit on. He's been slapped. He's had everything done to him. He's had blood draining down the front of his face from the crown that he wears. He has been hanging on a cross for 3 hours, having to push himself up every time he breathes. And then how does it describe him in his dying breath? It says, with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. If you were in that situation, how strong would your voice be? If you'd been through everything that he had been through, would even a whisper come out? And yet what Luke says is with a loud voice. The last words he'll ever say before his death, with a loud voice. And so maybe, among other things, the centurion knows how people die and knows that this isn't right. This isn't normal for him to be able to call out in this way. And he witnesses this, and what it says in the text in Luke there is that he glorified God. Now, there's two ways you could take that. You could think that he intentionally was glorifying the God of the Jews, and maybe he was. But maybe more likely what it's saying is that he glorified God whether he meant to or not, because any time that someone says that this man who died on the cross was a righteous man and the Son of God, he has glorified God. And so certainly the centurion had done just that. Those are the texts that tell us the story of this individual. And so what do we take away from this? Let's start with this. This man and this group that was with him, they were eyewitnesses to what happened on the cross. But so were plenty of Jews. So were plenty of others who were standing around watching all of this take place. But what was the difference? Because between Pontius Pilate and this centurion and the soldiers who were with him, they seemed to have an easier time believing this man who died was the Son of God than the Jews did. And so they both saw it. So what's the difference between the two? I think maybe the difference is the approach that they had beforehand. That the Romans saw something that they weren't expecting. That the death happened in a way that was so abnormal to them that it had to be something miraculous. It had to be something different, something from God. But the Jews saw the life of Christ and saw even his crucifixion, and they were expecting something. But they were expecting something that looked different. That looked different than he did. The other thing that we could say is that Jesus, not only did he live like no one else, which we know, but he died in a way that was different as well. He died in a way that was fully miraculous, the events surrounding it. He died in a way that was full of grace. He died in a way that was ready to forgive those who were killing him as he spoke the words. He died in a way that showed that he was the Son of God. But to make this more personal, more directed at each of us, the question kind of comes back to us, what does this statement that's made mean to you? Or what difference does it make? If someone looking at Christ on the cross said of him, truly this was the Son of God, how does that affect your life? Well, if it's true, it changes everything. If Jesus really is the Son of God, then everything must change. If he's not the Son of God, then none of this would really matter. But if he is not just another criminal that's being executed, but if he really is the Son of God that came into the world to save you from sin, and this is the price that he paid, then everything has to change as a result. That being said, we don't really know what happens after this story. As far as this centurion goes, we don't know if he became a New Testament Christian. That would be wonderful. We don't know if he continued on and reverted back to his old ways of life, which would be following false gods, which would be probably a pretty rough life as a centurion. We just aren't told what happens after this. But what we do know is that he had every reason in the world to believe that this man was who he said he was. That he is one of maybe a few hundred people in all of history that was privileged to watch the eternal plan of God as it happened. God's plan to save humanity moment by moment. He saw it take place. So what we can say for him is, we don't know what happened, but from this point on, he's without excuse. He has a responsibility knowing what happened and seeing that this was truly the Son of God. So then the question comes back to us again, what will we say? Knowing the story, and knowing the story hopefully pretty well by now, the story of Christ, the story of his death, the story that the centurion becomes a part of, what will I say when I see them? Will I, in the same way, declare that this is truly the Son of God and act on that? Or will I give a different response? This morning we have an opportunity, we have a chance to respond to God's invitation and to the story of God's love as shown through Christ. And this morning, if you need to respond to that invitation, this is the opportunity that you have now as we stand, as we sing.